Well, like I said, I'm a generalist, and it's my job to learn the world from every client's point of view. So if I've got a client that comes in that makes, let's just pick something, digital stereos. I trace the history of where it goes. It started in Japan, it moved into Korea, and then it moved into Southeast Asia as the technological suite changed for producing the product. So you look at where these things go to and why, and then you just project forward. I do a little work for the Defense Department. I don't do as much as I was planning on doing a year ago simply because I couldn't get through the contracting process. We're a small shop. There's less than a dozen of us,
Uh-huh.
and it takes two or three people working full time just to do the paperwork, and I was not interested. Also, I'm in the lucky position that we're turning away paid work right now, so we didn't feel the need to bend over backwards in order to get a government contract.
Yeah.
What we do for the government, though, is to look at things that are government policy for the current administration and play it forward so the people who are going to be implementing that policy know what they're actually going to be doing, which of course means that the military loves me and the administration far less so.
Hmm.
And lots of new equipment, but they don't have the operational force we have, and they certainly don't have the expertise that we have or the reach that we have. So let's start with the military issue, just to put that in context, and then kind of go to the really big stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, based on whose numbers you use, the Chinese have somewhere between 380 and 650 ships in their navy. We have about 270.
Hmm.
There are two problems with that comparison. The first one is it ignores size, because in navy issues, size matters. And so we have 12 ships that are 100,000 tons or bigger, the super carriers, and we have another three on the way. The Chinese have none of that class. Well, they've got one that they've built that is going through flight trials. It is intended to be a test bed. No one in the Chinese Navy suggests it will ever see combat.
And what are super carriers useful for?
Super carriers are what you use for projecting long range power.
Hmm.
So the beauty of a super carrier is you can basically take an air force that is larger. One ship has an air force that's larger than the air forces of all the countries in the world except for the top four. And you can move it wherever you want and choose the time and the place of an air and naval conflict and then sail on. So if you want to knock over a country, a super carrier is what you want, and we have 12 of them. We have smaller carriers outside of Israel right now. They're called Marine Expeditionary Units. They're about half the size of a carrier, but they also carry 3,000 to 5,000 Marines on them.
Uh-huh. And so we're
That's a different sort of awesome military platform.
yeah, yeah. I
We
saw
have
you.
10 of those.
Wow,
So
I saw you
we've
get
got we've
excited on
got
that. So
yeah, we've got 10 of the moderate sized carriers, and we've got 12 of the super carriers. And I would argue two super carriers that we have are greater, more power protection capability than the entirety of the Chinese Navy.
two,
Because the
two,
Chinese Navy, just two
two of our super carriers.
ships are blue water capable. They can go anywhere on the planet. 90% of China's naval fleet can't go more than 1,000 miles from shore.
Wow.
And that assumes they're going very slow in a straight lane to save fuel. If you're actually in combat conditions where you have to duck and weave and zigzag, they've got somewhere between 380 and 700 or sorry 650 ships based on where you draw the line. But most of these ships are like 2,000-ton corvettes versus a super carrier that's 100,000 tons.
Yeah.
There's this line of islands called the First Island Chain: Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia. Basically, they can't get past that. Yeah, Taiwan, the Chinese Navy was designed to go after Taiwan. And if
Hmm.
they decide to do it, that will be a really interesting fight that the Chinese, just playing the odds, will probably win. No way to know for sure. But yeah, that's it. There's a cultural thing there, Chinese reunification. It is the narrowest part of the first island chain. It is closest to the mainland. So if they're going to go anywhere, that's where they're going to go. And if you want to think really long term, the theory would be if they're going to break out of the first island chain, you do it at Taiwan, and then you can project past the chain with later generations of ships. I mean, that's some really optimistic thinking, but that's how it would start. We'd probably have a really interesting conversation in Washington. The amount of time that it would take us to get a fleet from San Diego to Taiwan, even odds is that the conflict would be over by the time we arrived. So we would then be in the position of having to do an amphibious assault to dislodge the Chinese, which is a very different picture from a naval fight to prevent the Chinese. Um, if I were king for a day in that scenario, I wouldn't even bother with that.
Yeah.
I'd just put a handful of destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin and cut the energy cord and basically do a blockade of China 2,000 miles out where they can't do anything about it. And within 6 months, the country would collapse because it wouldn't have any food or energy or exports. I mean, it would be really easy. China's the world's largest food importer. They take everything from the open market that they can, but more importantly, they import 80% of the stuff they need to grow their own food. So, I
From
mean, you'd be
from
looking at civilizational collapse in under a year.
yeah,
I
starving.
would assume they don't want that. The government in China has gotten a little weird of late.
And they import their food from, wasn't Ukraine a big farming?
Ukraine was a big source in the past. The U.S. is currently a big source.
So we export a lot to China.
Yeah, a lot of commodities, yes.
So
Commodities and technology.
yeah, so if we weren't exporting commodities, we would have a collapse over here as well, though, right?
Yeah.
No.
One of the beautiful things about food is if you don't have it, you die, which means that it's the last market that really crashes if things get strange. Yeah, so two things. Number one, you've all heard about the one-child policy. Very real thing. For 45 years, the Chinese have basically prevented people from having more than two kids at all, and in many cases, just the one. Second, and far more importantly, when a country industrializes, they also urbanize because all the industrial and manufacturing jobs are in cities. Well, when you're on a farm, kids are free labor. You have a bunch. When you're in a city, kids are an expense. You only have one or two. Well, since Nixon went to China, China has been through the most rapid urbanization process in human history. And so they've gone from having on average 7 kids to on average less than one in less than 40 years. Well, you play that forward, and there aren't enough people under age 50 in China to even theoretically repopulate anymore. This is now by far the fastest aging society in human history. And if the data that they have released of late is correct, they have seen their birth rate drop by more in the last 5 years, 6 years, than what happened to the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust. So
Wow.
that's assuming that the data that they usually lie about to make themselves look better is correct. The reality is probably a lot worse. And so, assuming nothing else goes wrong, we're looking at a national collapse in under a decade because of a lack of people.
A
That
national
assume,
collapse of China in a decade.
yes. Yeah, that assumes no military conflict that they can't win, no trade dispute that they can't win, nothing that looks like a trade war, no problems with the agricultural system, no financial bubble pops. Everything else goes perfectly. We're looking at 10 years. It's so much worse than that. Okay, so two things. Number one, the Chinese have a very different financial system than us. For us, if you want to start a business, buy a house, buy a car, whatever, you take out a loan and there's collateral. And if you don't pay down your debts as you go, you lose the collateral. For us, finance, money is an economic good and is treated as such. In China, the state controls that space. You've got the big state banks. The government restricts what the people can put their money into in order to keep it at the services of the government. And they expand their money supply by, it depends upon the month, but somewhere between 2 and 6 times per month what we do. And when you think about all the financial largesse that we have thrown out there in the last 20 years, and think that the Chinese have done a factor of 2 to 6 more than that, gives you an idea of just the scale of how broken this is. But if you have a bottomless supply of 0% capital, you can build a lot. And that is the Chinese industrial boom of the last 40 years. It's basically the Enron model applied to the real world.